Turkey's security forces fired tear gas to disperse rallies marking the anniversary of last year's anti-government protests. The US and China square off over maritime disputes in Southeast Asia after Washington accused Beijing of destabilizing actions. Bahrain's main opposition parties announced their boycott of next month's parliamentary elections. Hello there, you're watching AEE TV World News and I'm Fatima Basim. Clashes erupted between Turkish police and anti-government protesters in Istanbul and Ankara following rallies marking the first anniversary of last year's protests, which mushroomed into a revolt against Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan's rule.
Rallies marking the first anniversary of last year's protests, which turned into a revolt against Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan, were marred by yet more violence. Security forces clashed with protesters in both the capital Ankara and Istanbul. Riot police fired tear gas and water cannon to disperse some 1,000 people who hurled fireworks at police in the Turkish capital. Near Istanbul's iconic Taksim Square, the epicenter of last year's demonstrations, police also fired tear gas and water cannon at hundreds of people while arresting dozens of protesters. Earlier, Erdogan urged young Turks to ignore the call to stage a protest to mark the anniversary, issuing a stern warning to potential participants.
Tonight, Gezi Park protesters were said to be gathering at 7 p.m. They call for a rally at Taksim Square. If you attempt to go there, I'm sorry, but our security forces have clear orders. They will do whatever is necessary from A to Z. You will not be able to go to Taksim Square as you did last summer during the Gezi incidents.
Prior to the commemoration, riot police encircled the perimeter of Gezi Park and hundreds of plainclothes officers carrying batons patrolled Istiklal, a major shopping street that leads to Taksim Square. Turkish media reported that around 25,000 police officers, as well as dozens of water cannon trucks and armored vehicles, were deployed to prevent demonstrators from reaching the square. Tensions are on the rise after a 64-year-old woman who fell into a coma after inhaling tear gas during last year's protests died this week at an Istanbul hospital. A total of 8 people died and thousands were wounded as a result of the crackdown on last year's protests, which turned into the largest challenge to Erdogan's rule since his party came to power in 2002. For now, the anti-Erdogan sentiment in Turkey continues to overshadow the rule of his AK party. The Soma coal mine tragedy, which resulted in the death of over 300 people earlier this month, is still fresh in the memory of Turks after Erdogan paid little, if any, notice to the victims' suffering, a matter which is further expected to inflame the already tense atmosphere.
Maritime disputes in the South China Sea were the main topics of discussion at a security summit in Singapore. During the Asia-Pacific Forum, the US Secretary of Defense criticized China for what he called Beijing's destabilizing actions, which the Chinese labeled as baseless accusations.
Although these are known as peaceful waters, the South China Sea is not living up to its name. Following months of disputes and wrangling between China and neighboring countries in Southeast Asia over maritime control, the U.S. has decided to make its own contribution to the latest round of the row. Speaking at the Asia-Pacific Security Summit in Singapore, the U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel leveled serious accusations against Beijing.
China has called the South China Sea a sea of peace, friendship, and cooperation, and that's what it should be. But in recent months, China has undertaken destabilizing unilateral actions asserting its claims in the South China Sea.
Tensions have recently flared up in the South China Sea, claimed almost entirely by China, which has lately taken bold steps to enforce what it says are its historical rights. Fourth, Southeast Asian states, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, claim parts of the sea, with Manila and Hanoi being the most vocal in opposing China's claims. But the sea was not the only topic on the Pentagon chief's agenda at the summit. He also threatened U.S. actions if airspace is restricted, in reference to last year's declaration by China of an air defense identification zone.
We also oppose any effort by any nation to restrict overflight or freedom of navigation, whether from military or civilian vessels, from countries big or small. The United States will not look the other way when fundamental principles of the international order are being challenged.
The Chinese Defense Identification Zone covers areas over the East China Sea, which includes islands claimed both by Tokyo and Beijing. For its part, China has reacted angrily to Hagel's comments, with the Deputy Chief of the General Staff of the People's Liberation Army describing them as baseless.
Under such an important and public occasion, Secretary Hagel accuses China, and these accusations are groundless and have no reason whatsoever. First, I think Secretary Hagel's speech is full of hegemonism. Second, it is full of threat and intimidation. Third, the speech is full of inciting the destabilizing factors in the Asia-Pacific region to make troubles in the region. And fourth, it is full of non-constructive words at all.
Although the territorial disputes have overshadowed relations between the Asian states for decades, the recent spike in tensions can only be attributed to the increased U.S. involvement in the crisis, as Washington continues its so-called Pacific shift in an effort to confine a rapidly growing China.
To discuss this issue further, let's speak to Ram Abdullah Wailer. He is a columnist at the Tehran Times. Mr. Wailer, is the U.S. reviving Asia's territorial disputes in order to provoke a Chinese confrontation?
What is happening is really the tip of the iceberg. If you look at the words that Chuck Hagel uttered at that particular conference, I think you want to underline his phrase, fundamental principles of international order, which of course means U.S. hegemony. And this was confirmed by the Deputy Chief of the General Staff when he said that Hagel's speech was full of threats and intimidation. One form of intimidation is this Trans-Pacific Partnership. This creates sort of a free trade zone or free trade agreement between the United States and a number of Asian countries, but it excludes China. Recently, the U.S. has also won a series of cases before the World Trade Organization over Chinese tariffs on American export cars. This is somewhat laughable because, first of all, the World Trade Organization was established in 1995 and replaced the General Tariff Agreement, which was something that was created by the U.S. Shortly after the end of World War II. So it should be no surprise that it would rule in favor of the United States. Second, it was the U.S. corporations themselves that offshored the manufacturing plants to China in the first place. Another recent blow to U.S. hegemony in the region is the $400 billion Russia-China gas deal, which is to extend for 30 years, and that gives Moscow a huge market for gas, its leading export, and further cements ties between the former two principal U.S. adversaries. Historically, of course, Russia and China were allies during the Cold War. And China it has not only diverged with the Obama administration as far as its policy, the China's policy in the South China Sea, but then we have the intimidation factor with the strong U.S. military support and alliance with Japan. So we have a number of factors entering into this. It's not merely a case of some territorial dispute, and it's very much about.
But Mr. Wailer, how much are the United States allies willing to work against China and against their own interests in the region?
you have a number of countries that are part of this Trans-Pacific Agreement. But again, as I said before, China is the only one that's been excluded. And it should be noted that all of this recent trouble is brewing on the heels of the indictment of 5 Chinese military officials by a U.S. grand jury on charges of cyber espionage. Of course, the U.S. is a world leader in that field. The indictment itself was on behalf of a number of major U.S. corporations, including Westinghouse, U.S. Steel, Alcoa, and others, which are worth billions of dollars, of course, and this benefits the U.S. and government. So just as Edward Snowden pointed out recently, the U.S. government engages in espionage for the benefit of U.S. corporations. So that's really what the heart of this whole deal is maintaining U.S. dollar domination in the world. And of course, it's just like former Assistant Secretary of Housing Catherine Fitz said, quote, "My assessment is that 90% of the U.S. dollar comes from the U.S. military," unquote. And worse than this, it's really the heart of economic enslavement imposed upon the world by the U.S. It's this NSA Black Pearl cyber espionage program, which, among other functions, extracts data from the SWIFT, the international banking network. So in short, the U.S. is and has been for years engaged in this in-depth and invasive cyber espionage, much more so than China, or what China would be capable of. And all of this has been under the rubric of U.S. national security.
Yes, and how much should the Chinese be worried over the Japanese Prime Minister's recent calls to amend his country's peace constitution?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question. Could you repeat that?
How much should the Chinese be worried over the Japanese Prime Minister's recent calls to amend his country's peace constitution?
Well, this is a display of expected Japanese militarism. Of course, after being under U.S. domination since the end of World War II, one would expect that Japan would want to reorganize its military in a much stronger defensive posture. I think the main concern of China is the support that's being given by the U.S. and the fact that the United States is essentially encircling China from Afghanistan to the west of China to Japan and South Korea to the east.
All right, Yuram Abdullah Waila, a columnist at the Tehran Times, thank you for speaking to Al-Ittijah.
Thank you for having me.
Moving on to some other news now. Bahrain's main opposition parties announced their boycott of next month's parliamentary elections, vowing no political participation unless full-scale reforms are implemented by the country's ruling monarchy. The comments were made during a press conference which included all parties opposed to the Bahraini regime. The statement further highlighted that any political participation on the part of the opposition would take place only after radical reforms are introduced, including the authorization of peaceful protests and the release of all political prisoners. The opposition also said that the Bahraini people should be the only source of authority.
We have realized that from 2011 until now, the regime has rejected reforms and therefore we must not participate in the upcoming elections. If the government carries out reforms, we will change our position. The opposition will not boycott the election but all practices with this dictatorship. The boycott will be translated through the means of a civil and peaceful resistance.
Earlier, we spoke to resigned Bahraini MP Jawad Fayrouz about the opposition's efforts to pressure the government to introduce reforms.
The current regime to the international community, and I think that these steps should be taken not since 2011, and we've been promised this reform since 2001 when the current king came in power. Unfortunately, we agreed with him in the national chart in 2001, but what he done since he imposed on the Bahrainis new constitution 2002 on 14 February 2002, he imposed a new constitution and taken entire power, either legislative or judiciary or executive power in his hand and his family's hand. And from there, the opposition started to boycott. Yes, for 4 years they boycotted in elections, parliamentary election from 2002 to 2006. But then, under pressure of international community, they wanted to give one more chance. Maybe they can make some changes if they participated. Yes, they participated in 2006. But at the end, they found out they cannot change much within the system. So all this accumulated of the uprising in 2011, and once again, we are on the score one without any serious changes, without any serious reform that will, based on the, first of all, independence of all the authorities, and the ruling family should have their normal power were being promised even from the date of the independence of Bahrain, that full authority will be in the hand of the people, in addition to the elected government. The government is not serious to the dialogue, and whenever they call for dialogue positively, opposition, they agreed on, but at the end they found it is not serious dialogue. See, there is a dispute about what dialogue the government wants. They don't want the dialogue between the ruling family or the government and the opposition. They want a dialogue between the different faction of the people, different groups, either to be loyal opposition or Sunni and Shia, and they think that they should be a neutral body and it is not concerning them at all. And here the dispute, we think that a dialogue should be between the opposition and the ruling family and the government, which still they don't want to admit there is any problem with the current regime and current.
The authorities in Kiev have stepped up their military operation against pro-Russian activists in the east of Ukraine. However, civilians are increasingly being targeted as Ukraine's so-called National Guard fired mortar rounds at a children's hospital on Friday, forcing hundreds of residents to flee to Crimea.
The eastern city of Slavyansk is once again under attack. A helicopter flying above the city's sky could be seen dropping flares, while artillery fire could be heard from a distance. Tension in the region remained high as the military stepped up its so-called anti-terrorist operations against pro-Russian activists in Ukraine's east. Fearing for their lives, women and children in the city were forced to leave their homes and head to Crimea.
People leaving the city, they're abandoning the city. People are scared because there are shootings.
We are worried for our children. It's terrible. The children's hospital has been destroyed. Same for the schools. In our houses, all the windows have been broken because of the explosions. It's impossible to live like this.
We are afraid. Today at 5 in the morning there were some bombings near our flat. And also overnight, not far away near the city. And we're very scared.
On Friday, continuous shelling struck a children's hospital and a clinic, wounding at least 7 minors. A group of some 200 children from Slavyansk have been evacuated to Russia's Crimea. The children aged between 8 and 16 are being housed in various summer camps on the peninsula. Their journey was not entirely trouble-free. There were reports that buses carrying the evacuated children were not initially permitted to cross the border by Ukrainian guards. However, all of them have since arrived in Russia. While Kiev's troops say they are not targeting civilians, artillery fire regularly hits residential areas in Slavyansk. The city has become the scene of constant battles between local militia and troops loyal to Kiev. likely to force a further exodus of the civilian population.
Meanwhile, thousands of residents in the eastern Ukraine city of Donetsk have staged rallies calling for peace as Kiev stepped up those military operations against pro-Russian activists. Waving flags of both Russia and the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, protesters sang along to a popular Soviet-era song while vowing to continue the fight for a break with Kiev. Well, NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen announced on Friday that ambassadors from Russia and NATO countries will meet for the first time since the Ukraine crisis began back in March.
With regard to NATO, we are right now reviewing our future relationship with Russia. As you know, we have already suspended all practical cooperation with Russia. NATO foreign ministers will discuss our future relationship with Russia when they meet by the end of June. So I would expect all allies to take national decisions within this greater context.
You're watching AEE TV World News, still to come. Libyans staged rallies in support of a rogue general amid an ongoing political paralysis in the country. Welcome back to AEE TV World News. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Turkey's security forces fired tear gas to disperse rallies marking the anniversary of last year's anti-government protests. The US and China square off over maritime disputes in Southeast Asia after Washington accused Beijing of destabilizing actions. And Bahrain's main opposition parties announced their boycott of next month's parliamentary elections. Thousands have staged rallies in the Libyan capital Tripoli in support of a rogue general and the leader of the self-declared National Army, Khalifa Haftar. The general has been fighting Islamist militia groups in the country's east for weeks as he continues to lock horns with the central government over the right to hold power.
Two rival governments and two rival armies. The political divisions in Libya have laid the foundations for a military confrontation that threatens to plunge the North African state into an all-out civil war. The tide of public support for General Khalifa Haftar has gathered significant momentum in recent weeks. Three slogans were painted on this mock coffin: the cabinet of new Prime Minister Ahmed Maitig, the General National Congress, and Ansar al-Sharia. Demonstrators in Tripoli's Martyr Square accused this triangle of being behind their hardship. Meanwhile, only a few hundred meters away, Supporters of the Islamist militia held a rival demonstration. They denounced Haftar's attempts to seize power and called for a peaceful political transition. To make matters worse, the two rival sides continue to assert themselves as the legitimate governing body in Libya. Interim Prime Minister Abdallah Al-Thani insists that a new government can only be chosen through a new parliament, while maintaining that the appointment of his rival Ahmed Maitig by the outgoing parliament was invalid. The struggle for power comes only weeks ahead of the elections, which for many would do little to rescue the oil-rich country from its political paralysis.
African affairs expert Ayo Johnson joins us now via Skype from London. Ayo, how much are General Haftar's actions driven by the need to fight terrorism as opposed to pursuing his own personal ambitions?
I think it's one of the two, really. Firstly, he's got ambitions to rule the country and to govern and control power. But I think deep down, he had a vision to rid the country of extremists as he sees it. And to that extent, he's sort of gone against the rule of law. He's broken ranks with a lot of people. And for all intents and purposes, Libya, democracy is, if one were to call it so, is in trouble between internal struggle, ultimately civil war.
Yes, but rallies today have proven that he has been able to convince Libyans of an alternative rule.
Well, I'm not sure whether he's been able to convince Libyans of an alternative rule. Maybe Libyans themselves are fed up with this tit-for-tat, backbiting. Ever so often, one leader's in power and another is ultimately trying to take over power. Maybe they're all confused, upset, worried, and they just want peace. And are willing to follow the general irrespective of what he says. It's questionable as to what the level of support is, but he does command support, be it through intimidation or not. Nonetheless, it comes at odds with the current Prime Minister and the legislator as to how Libya will move forward. We must understand that the United States and European allies who support the government will come at odds with what this general is proclaiming.
Will he be able to bring back stability to Libya?
Well, Libya, for all intents and purposes, is very much the Wild West and has been so ever since they ousted Gaddafi. It's been the East, which is very much controlled by rebels, controlled by various clans, and very much Tripoli that has a bewildered, very weak governing structure. To that extent, it's questionable as to what the true successes would be. Even if this general were to rule in the short term, which will leave Libya's democracy in tatters, the future is who would say there wouldn't be another general who would want to oust him. So I think there lies the problem. Libya needs a process for which is fair, a process that has international consensus, and a process for which the wider population can accept.
Considering that both sides are willing to back down, are we going to see a civil war break out in the country?
Well, we've had many versions of civil war ever since the ousting of Gaddafi by NATO and Western forces. And what we will find moving forward is little pockets of such revolutions or such civil wars as you've expressed. This is not going to go away. Libya is a country that's hurting, a country that has way too many problems, a country that's lost its way, and a country that's clearly not going to come together in a hurry. It's going to take time. There needs to be stability, and what the general is doing currently right now is at odds with what the international world and very much what Libyans in terms of their own democracy are asking for.
All right, Ayo Johnson, African affairs expert, thank you for speaking to Ali Tija.
Thank you.
Fresh clashes have erupted between Iraqi troops and militants belonging to the Al-Qaeda offshoot of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. The fighting erupted on the outskirts of the ISIL stronghold of Fallujah, west of the capital Baghdad. With aerial cover, Iraqi soldiers tried to enter Fallujah from the Saklawiya area. According to a tribal leader, the clashes resulted in deaths and injuries on both sides, as well as civilian casualties. The latest unrest comes after security forces launched an apparently unsuccessful assault against the city, which has been out of government control since the beginning of the year. In a new wave of deadly terrorist attacks, at least 20 people have been killed following mortar attacks carried out by foreign-backed militants on Syria's northwestern city of Aleppo. The militants fired 40 mortar shells on several neighborhoods of the flashpoint city, targeting civilians and causing massive material damage. Eyewitnesses said that the mortars came from a militant-held district of the city. Meanwhile, at least 20 people were killed after foreign-backed militants detonated a bomb in a tunnel located under the old city of Aleppo. According to the opposition-backed Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, clashes broke out after the explosion, killing at least one insurgent. U.S. officials have confirmed that an American national fighting alongside foreign-backed militants carried out a deadly suicide bombing in Syria. The State Department spokeswoman Jen Psaki identified the suicide bomber as Munir Mohammed Abu Salha, who is believed to have driven a truck bomb into an army checkpoint in the northern province of Idlib. The confirmation marks the first time that an American national was involved in such an attack in Syria, amid growing fears of the number of Westerners flooding into the country to join al-Qaeda-linked groups. Egypt's outgoing interim president has issued a decree dishonoring the Egyptian flag or not standing for the national anthem, a criminal offence, punishable by sentences of up to 1 year in prison and a fine of more than $4,000. Controversies over the flag and national anthem have erupted in the past, as some Egyptians refused to stand for the anthem and others tore up the flag in protest. According to the presidential decree, the flag and the national anthem are symbols of the state that must be honoured. Well, Egypt's defeated presidential candidate Hamdin Sabahi is contesting former army chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's landslide victory earlier in the week. His accusations are unlikely to change much, however, as Sisi embarks on reforming the country's faltering economy.
Although he was trounced in the elections, the now former Egyptian presidential candidate Hamdin Sabahi is not going down without a fight. Preliminary results showed that the leftist politician Sabahi won 3% of the vote in comparison to the 93% garnered by former army chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Sabahi's campaign said in a statement that it had issued a legal complaint to the Elections Committee, objecting to the existence of campaigning inside polling stations by al-Sisi supporters, among other abuses. However, these complaints look to be too insignificant to affect the final results, as al-Sisi is set to be declared President of Egypt. The overwhelming victory is seen as a mandate for al-Sisi to reform the country's ailing economy, suffering from corruption, high unemployment, and a widening budget deficit, aggravated by fuel subsidies that could cost nearly $19 billion in the next fiscal year. But following a series of television interviews he gave ahead of the vote, many Egyptians feel al-Sisi had not spelled out a clear vision of how he would tackle Egypt's problems, instead making a general call for people to work hard and be patient. Somehow his message was welcomed by Arab monarchies in the Persian Gulf, which were the benefactors of the coup against former Islamist President Mohammed Morsi. We all need to support Egypt as a nation and its people. Egypt and its people are dear to us. The challenges are great and the expectations are huge, but the moment that we see today is the most hope-filled for 3 years. Once al-Sisi is sworn in as president, he will be walking a very tight rope. The economy will be his pole in this high-stake game, and the country where street protests have helped topple 2 presidents in 3 years.
Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas announced that the formation of a Palestinian unity government backed by rivals Hamas and Fatah will be announced on Monday. Abbas added that he had already been warned by the Israelis of punitive steps against the new alliance. The formation of the government would be the most significant step yet toward ending a crippling 7-year Palestinian political split. Meanwhile, clashes between Israeli occupation forces and Palestinian protesters erupted in the West Bank. The demonstrators rallied in solidarity with Palestinian detainees on hunger strike in Israeli jails.
Israeli occupation forces clashed with Palestinian youths following a rally in solidarity with Palestinian hunger strikers in Israeli prisons. Soldiers used tear gas and stun grenades to disperse the crowd at the Al Arub refugee camp. Palestinian demonstrators retaliated by throwing stones at Israeli soldiers. Several people were arrested, including a photographer. The protest was organized by the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine to show support for Palestinian detainees in Israeli jails who were stripped of their basic human rights. Around 240 Palestinian detainees are on a partial hunger strike protesting against their administrative detention, which allows the Israeli entity to keep prisoners without trial. For their part, human rights groups have condemned administrative detention. The hunger strikers have refused to consume anything but water and salt for 38 days. The Palestinian Ministry of Prisoners' Affairs said 1,500 other prisoners are expected to join the hunger strike on Sunday.
Official reports have confirmed that a roadside bomb killed at least 14 civilians in eastern Afghanistan. The latest violence comes as NATO troops prepare to leave the country after 13 years of war. The governor of Gura district said the victims were returning from a wedding ceremony when the bomb ripped through their vehicle, adding that the death toll could still rise. In a written statement, President Barack Obama said that U.S. Army Sergeant Bowie Bergdahl, who was held for nearly 5 years by the Taliban, has been freed. As part of Bergdahl's release, the United States is turning over 5 Taliban detainees currently being held at the Guantanamo Bay to the custody of Qatar. Bergdahl's release follows months of indirect U.S. Taliban talks with Qatar acting as the intermediary. Only part of the recent NBC interview with former intelligence contractor Edward Snowden was actually aired. However, excerpts have now been posted online showing that the network neglected to air critical statements about the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
You know, and this is a key question that the 9/11 Commission considered. And what they found in the postmortem, when they looked at all of the classified intelligence from all of the different intelligence agencies, they found that we had all of the information we needed as an intelligence community, as a classified sector, as the national defense of the United States, to detect this plot. We actually had records of the phone calls from the United States and out. The CIA knew who these guys were. The problem was not that we weren't collecting information. It wasn't that we didn't have enough dots. It wasn't that we didn't have a haystack. It was that we did not understand the haystack that we have. If we're missing things, like the Boston Marathon bombings, where all of these mass surveillance systems, every domestic dragnet in the world, didn't reveal guys that the Russian intelligence service told us about by name. Is that really the best way to protect our country? Or are we trying to throw money at a magic solution that's actually not just costing us our safety, but our rights and our way of life?
The leader of Malawi's Democratic Progressive Party and brother of the country's former president has been declared the winner of the disputed presidential elections after garnering 36.4% of the votes.
Malawi's opposition Democratic Progressive Party, led by Peter Mutharika, has won the May 20th elections. Malawi's Electoral Commission made the announcement following disputes over the validity of the vote.
Do hereby declare candidate Professor Peter Mutharika and Mr. Saulos Klaus Chilima of the Democratic Progressive Party as President-elect and Vice President-elect, respectively.
The Electoral Commission said Mutharika came ahead of Lazarus Chakwera, who obtained 27.8% of the vote, while outgoing President Joyce Banda garnered 20.2%. Banda has reportedly accepted the election results despite claims made earlier this week that the vote was null and void, amid allegations of polling corruption and fraud. The results were announced minutes after a court refused to grant an extension for a recount that had been sought by Chakwera. About 7.5 million people were eligible to vote in the elections, which was described as Malawi's closest fought poll in 20 years. The election was chaotic, with many polling stations opening up hours late and frustrated voters setting one polling station alight. Now, with the results announced and Mutharika declared as the country's new president, he is expected to begin the inauguration process within the next few days and forego the presidential transition period in order to avoid facing contention from his opponents.
Nubian wrestling is an age-old sport in Sudan and has become part of people's daily lives. Our Khartoum correspondent Ahmed Saeed Ahmed takes us now into the world of this folk sport.
Two competitors stand crouched, waving their hands in the air as they gauge each other's weaknesses and strengths. And suddenly, they're locked in a power grip, each trying to bring the other to the ground in a bid to be declared the winner. That is one of the techniques of Nubian wrestling, an ages-old sport in Sudan.
In origin, wrestling is in the heart of the culture and heritage of Nubian Mountains, where it's a part of how people are brought up and they learn it by nature. It is performed in certain rites and customs, and for the most part, it's linked to harvest seasons after autumn.
It's a part of our history. It's based here in Sudan, in Kordofan. People over there, it's like part of their daily thing.
Different tribes in Sudan have developed a liking to Nubian wrestling, especially the Baggara, the cattle herding tribes. And each tribe has its own way of going about the folk sport.
Wrestling rites differ from one area to another, in other words, from one tribe to another. Every tribe has a sort of wrestling with certain rites and they compete against each other.
The sport is widely celebrated and has many fans in Sudan. People turn out in huge numbers to enjoy the matches and cheer for the teams and players they like.
It seems really interesting and everybody's really into it, so it's really fun watching both the players and everybody else around here.
I'm from Lebanon and I've come here to watch Sudanese wrestling. The wrestling is very beautiful and I'm enjoying my time.
The intensity of the matches varies from being quick-paced to laid-back. The players choose between aggressive wrestling styles and those styles where tact plays a bigger role in winning the match.
Yeah, they're great. I can't believe some of the stuff they can do. Like the guy just pulled the other guy by the leg. I don't know. It's pretty fun.
My impressions about the wrestling matches is very strong competitors, but my overall impression of it is of the great atmosphere in the crowd, a very friendly atmosphere in the crowd. And some of the matches are very exciting, some of them go on and are less exciting, but when there's big action, it's great to see.
Nubian wrestling also attracts fans from other countries, including tourists and expats.
Yeah. My colleagues at work, I'll tell them to come because it's a good sporting event, but it's also a nice time to come here and be part of the crowd.
I think I'll definitely come back. Yeah, for sure. Every time somebody comes visits us, we bring them here. My father-in-law's visiting, so we just brought him here to check out what's going on.
The players have famous nicknames which their fans chant during the matches to boost the competitors' morale. What is surprising is that though this is a fighting-based sport, the players' sportsmanship towers high above all other sentiments.
Nubian wrestling has been around for years too many to count and has survived through different historical periods of the country. And despite its name, Nubian wrestling brings together fighters and competitors from across the country. Ahmed Saeed Ahmed, Al Ittijah News Channel, Khartoum.
In the lead-up to the FIFA World Cup, England manager Roy Hodgson is taking a young squad to Brazil. But the English team faces a daunting challenge as it prepares to face off with the group of death, with Italy, Uruguay and Costa Rica.
England manager Roy Hodgson has picked a youthful squad for the World Cup in Brazil, with an average age of just 26. Veteran three Lions, Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard and Wayne Rooney are still likely to form the team's backbone. But England stalwarts Ashley Cole and Rio Ferdinand have been left out of the squad in favour of Lion cubs like teenagers Luke Shaw and Raheem Sterling.
Of course, there are a number of senior players who will undoubtedly feature, but there's a lot of positions around those senior players that are up for grabs, and at the moment everyone is doing their best to grab them.
The British tabloid newspapers have dubbed England's the group of death, with a crucial opening match against four-times champions Italy kicking things off on June 14. Uruguay, spearheaded by Liverpool's Luis Suarez, will also be tough to beat, while on paper Costa Rica should end bottom of the table. England have often been hampered in the past by off-field distractions. But this group of players say Hodgson has cultivated a positive atmosphere.
The young squad, they bring like a no fear factor, and then we've got the likes of Gerrard and Lampard who are there to calm everything down. They've been there 3 or 4 times, so it's a good mix, and we just want to go over there and do the country proud.
All eyes will be on Manchester United striker Wayne Rooney, who is yet to score in 2 World Cups, but says he is in the best shape possible to make his mark. England will also have to shape up against the cloying heat and humidity of Manaus and have been training in extra layers to prepare.
Yeah, it's obviously going to play a part, but I think we've got enough time to adapt. Obviously we went to Portugal last week, which helped. We're coming here and training here, and obviously then going to Miami as well, so I'm sure when we get out there as well, that'll sort of adapt our bodies to what it's going to be like.
England may be without a World Cup win since their one victory in 1966, but that doesn't stop the barmy army of England fans from expecting.
All right, here's a reminder of tonight's top stories. Turkey's security forces fire tear gas to disperse rallies marking the anniversary of last year's anti-government protests. The US and China square off over maritime disputes in Southeast Asia after Washington accused Beijing of destabilizing actions. And Bahrain's main opposition parties announced their boycott of next month's parliamentary elections. That's all from me and the Al Ittijah News team. Thank you very much for watching and good night.